Alright, now I'd like to turn to the topic of gun violence within the United States. And I already made a video kind of talking about some of the issues with making comparisons between different countries internationally. And one of the problems with that I wasn't really explicit about is that an absence of control variables. There's a big difference between a country like Israel and, say, the United States, or the UK and the United States. They're just totally different in a lot of ways. And so it's really hard scientifically to prove anything. Now, within the United States, this is still true, but to a much less extent. You're in the same country, a number of the variables are the same, and there's a lot more data, and the data is more uniform. So, for instance, in the UK, they just record crime differently than they do in the United States, which makes it almost impossible to form valid statistical, distinctions. And I've heard, there's even a lot of accusations that certain countries will purposely misrepresent their crime. One thing I've always heard in Japan, they say they have high suicide. I've been told, I can't verify this, but it seems possible that a lot of times, a man will go and commit suicide, and before he does, he'll kill his entire family. And rather than count that as, a couple homicides and a suicide, the Japanese government will usually just count that as multiple suicides, where, not really multiple suicides. But in the United States, certainly the United States government is no more objective than any other, but at least its biases are going to be uniform. So the FBI, even if we could argue that they lie and other kinds of bad things, there's no reason to think that they're going to lie about the statistics between Louisiana and Mississippi. Whatever biases they have, they're going to apply to all the states, probably. And they can make mistakes, but... So, one thing when we look at gun violence, and specifically homicide in the United States, is that it's extremely localized. I remember a good source on this is "More Guns, Less Crime" by John Lott. He says there's about 4,000 counties in the United States, and in half of them, in any given year, there are less than one homicide. And in something like 25 or 30% of the rest, there's usually between 1 and 2 homicides. So, for literally hundreds of millions of Americans, a homicide is an extremely unusual, very rare event. And the rates in most places are very low. Where I live, my county has about 60,000 people. It's mostly rural, but there are some cities and some centers of population, and there's about one homicide, not just gun homicide, any homicide, every other year. Which, when you do the math, that's one homicide over 120,000, which is like a quarter of the UK, or it's less than the UK's. Way more people here die in car accidents or drown. There's a river in the city. 1 or 2 people drown in that every year, not to mention other lakes or whatever. So, and that is not, if you watch this, you might say, well, that's your idyllic community or whatever. That's actually totally normal. Just 1 or 2% of the counties account for the vast majority of the homicides. 65% of all homicides in the United States, they occur in 5 cities, which are New York City, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Detroit, and Chicago. And with the exception of Detroit, those other 4 cities basically have the most stringent gun control laws in the entire country. This is especially true in Washington and Chicago, both of which, in the case of D.C., they've had, up until the last 2 years, they've had basically a ban on all guns. Since that ban's been lifted, by the way, their crime rate, including their homicide rate, has actually gone down. Chicago, full registration of all guns, and up until recently, a complete ban on handguns. They've also seen a reduction in crime since that ban has elapsed. LA and New York, not specific so much to them being cities, but in both those states, do not allow concealed carry. At least they don't have shall issue, they have may issue. And in both those regions, may issue is basically not issue unless you're Michael Bloomberg or Tom Cruise. You have to be rich and powerful in those places to protect yourself legally. And I don't know so much about LA, but in New York, they have an extremely anti-gun prosecutorial government. So even if you legally owned a gun, if you ever used it, you'd probably be persecuted. And people will say, well, those cities are the biggest cities in the country, and it's true. The LA and New York are the biggest cities. Detroit certainly is not. I think Chicago is the third biggest city, but then there's a large number of other urban centers that are comparably large, especially in Texas. You have Houston, Dallas, and San Antonio. You also have Phoenix, Miami, Indianapolis. These places all have much lower rates of crime, much lower total numbers of crime, and they are much more gun-friendly. So, and I mean, Detroit was pretty gun-unfriendly up until about 10 years ago, and after they passed shall issue in Michigan, basically it hasn't had any additional gun control. But Detroit's an interesting case. Anyone who's ever been there would know. The areas, the vast majority of the violent crime is urban, where rates of gun ownership are generally a lot less. And the rural settings, which by most world standards would have to be considered idyllic. Almost all types of crime are pretty low in most places. And it's not uncommon to have areas where a murder is an unheard of event. Not everywhere, but it's not uncommon. And the thing is in many of those places, guns are basically ubiquitous. If the statistic holds that every other household has a gun, the fact that there are so many urban households that don't have guns necessarily implies that in rural settings there are a lot more. And I'd say, off the bat, just roughly, it's probably closer to 75%, and in some places it's probably close to 100%. Now, if availability of guns is a cause of crime, then these rural environments, they should be way worse. The other thing is the rural environments have far fewer police. In fact, the police presence is effectively zero in a lot of places. I mean, you can call, there's no way they can get to where you are anytime soon a lot of the time. Whereas in a city, there's usually cops around all the time. I mean, that doesn't mean they get there fast, but they're around. So, Rachel Maddow did a show recently, and it's been copied by a couple people, where she compared the states with the highest per capita gun ownership, but she only compared the top 5 and the 5 most violent and the 5 least violent. But you have like a state like Hawaii. I can imagine a couple variables that make Hawaii unusual. Alaska does have very high gun ownership, and it does have a high homicide rate. I can think of a couple variables that might explain that, like the sun not being up, or the fact that there's a lot of alcoholism, and you have a lot of Eskimos who can't hold their liquor. So the thing is, when she makes that claim, and when people say, well, this state and this state, there's actually a correlation, a real correlation, then that they should be able to quantify that. A perfect correlation would be 1. If they could come and say, we've done the numbers and there's a 1-to-1 correlation between gun availability and homicide rates. I've never heard anybody ever claim that. And the other thing is, even if they could, correlation is not causation. So it's conceivable that something could correlate and still not be related. The thing is there really isn't a correlation, because if there was, it could be quantified. And someone could say, hey, correlation is 0.85 or 0.75 or 0.5, and the fact is that there isn't really a correlation, or if there is, it's very low, to the point where it's not convincing. So, and the other thing is, when you point out that, well, Chicago has strict gun laws and they have high crime, DC has strict gun laws and they have high crime, New York has strict gun controls and they have high crime, the retort is usually, well, it's true, but they have high crime despite their bans, and it's because guns are so easy to get in adjacent districts. And this seems plausible, except if it's really true, then those adjacent districts should have even worse crime. So if the high crime in Washington, D.C. is because Virginia has lenient gun laws, then Virginia should have even worse crime than D.C., because their criminals don't even have to travel. Their easy guns don't even have to be imported; they can just be purchased right there. And the fact is that that's not the case. And in the case of Virginia, you have like Alexandria, Virginia, which is demographically, in terms of socioeconomic status, very similar to D.C. It's just across the Potomac River, and yet it has, I think 4 times lower homicide rate. Why? I mean, they should have an easy time getting guns there. And the same thing, I mean, how can the New York mayor claim that, New York's problem is because New Hampshire and Vermont and Pennsylvania have easy gun access? Those places have far lower crime. If easy gun access in Vermont is causing all this death in New York, then there should be a crime wave in Vermont, and as far as I know, there isn't one, never has been. So there isn't really a correlation, and anecdotally, I mean, there's clearly not a causal link, because there are so many places that have lots of guns and they just have very low, almost no crime. And if guns turned us into homicidal barbarians magically, rural America would have long since gone extinct. And that doesn't seem to actually be about to happen. So I have to say that it's a pretty glaring problem with the premise, and I think it's one that people should examine.